A girl with blonde hair and blue eyes sat reading a letter. A maid stood next to the girl and told her that all she had to do was write her name on the scroll. She took her hand with a quill and helped her sign. The girl's full name appeared on the letter, Arabella Bliss Ayu Delure. The maid complimented the girl. Arabella frowned and asked Chamberlain Windell if His Highness would visit them. The man with gray hair, nicely styled, and a mustache bowed and replied that His Highness would not visit them because he spent most of his time resting in the palace unless he needed medical treatment from the outside due to burns. The aide cut into the conversation and said she didn't think she would be able to meet His Highness today and asked if she had heard her. Arabella smiled stupidly, the maid talking to her like a 4-year-old child. Her name was Betty, and she was the maid of Lady Arabella of the Duchy of Duller. At this time, the girl was playing a role. She took the hand of the protagonist and sat down to her, looking into her eyes. Everyone in the girl's room thought Arabella was stupid, and they had been right, at least 3 days ago. Arabella was a mentally retarded girl who knew only 4 words: Daddy, Arabella, Betty, and food. At that time, the main character was not in this body, and it all started with one horrible nightmare that was about a young, rich, and attractive math teacher who became famous in the most competitive academic town in the country. The name of the main character in her past life was Seo Kyung Kang. She was working late to check some research, so she had to catch a cab to get home, but suddenly a giant truck appeared out of nowhere. The girl couldn't even try to dodge or scream. Everything happened in a flash. When the truck hit the main character, she felt every bone in her body break, and then woke up in Arabella's body. The girl was shaking all over and didn't realize where she was. The heroine had a headache, and the place she found herself in was not like a dream. She remembered that she was hit by a truck. The maid appeared out of nowhere, calling loudly to her lady. The assistant noticed that Arabella had mussed her hair again, but yesterday she had styled it well and asked if the girl liked it. The protagonist looked at her perplexed and did not understand who this girl was. The maid with a tray in her hands asked the girl to hold the mirror because she needed to do her hair again. Seo-kyun, who was already Arabella, didn't understand why this girl was doing her hair. The main character saw the mirror and decided to look at it. When she saw her new reflection, she couldn't contain her emotions and screamed. Her screaming frightened the maid. Arabella yelled to the whole house who she was now. The blonde pulled her cheeks to wake up, telling herself that she must still be asleep. The aide started to say who the girl was, but was interrupted when she heard the Duchess's coherent speech. Arabella was already in pain, pulling her cheeks in an attempt to wake up. The maid looked at her in surprise. The assistant, from what the lady had said a whole sentence, started to scream and asked if she had said it. The blonde turned to her, startled by her sudden scream, and said that it was indeed her. The main character asked glumly, "What was the big deal?" she said. The maid fainted. Arabella jumped up to her and grabbed her by the collar, shouting at her not to faint, because the girl couldn't do that. She was the one who should faint. Arabella panicked and asked the maid if she had a cell phone, because she needed to call her family right away. The blonde panicked and started yelling for her to wake up, and the maid sort of opened her eyes. The girl rejoiced, but as soon as the assistant saw her, she immediately bounced away and stared with huge eyes at her Duchess. She compared the girl to a fearsome cat that was ready to pounce on her. The protagonist angrily asked her assistant why she kept acting as if she had seen a ghost. The girl confusedly folded her hands in a lock, put them to her mouth, and asked her lady if she was really talking now. Arabella countered by also questioning why the maid was asking the same question and asked that it was strange that she could talk. But the maid explained that it was only yesterday that there were only 4 words she could speak. The protagonist stared at her in shock. The maid began to explain that the Duchess had some intellectual disabilities. She knew a few other words as well, but mostly she used these 4. And by the way she introduced herself, her name was Betty, Arabella's maid who serves her father, his lordship. Arabella was in great shock that she had a personal maid. The girl asked her to wait so that she could digest the information she had already received. But Betty continued that another word the girl kept repeating was her name. She said her full name was Arabella Blin Ayu Delure. She was 24 this year, and she wanted to go on, but the feelings came over her. Betty was moved and threw her arms around Arabella, saying that the heavens had finally had mercy on her. She couldn't believe that the girl was speaking well. The protagonist didn't understand anything, only listened. The maid told her fears, that she was very afraid that when Arabella had to enter the imperial family, she would be bullied by the prince consort and manipulate her life. When the girl heard about the marriage, she was shocked and frantically began to ask Betty about it. The maid told her that the Duchess was getting married, so the girl asked when the wedding would take place. Betty replied that the wedding was to take place in 3 days. When she signed the contract, it was her wedding day, so she was trembling with excitement. Arabella, watching the scroll she had signed being passed to other people, thought it all made no sense, and remembered that only recently she had been in a car accident, and now she was sitting on a couch in a lavishly furnished room in someone else's body. What was worse was that the girl whose body she had been reborn into was a 24-year-old fool. Now she had to play the part of the fool so people wouldn't notice. And on top of that, in the middle of all this mess, she had to marry a complete stranger who was covered in burns. The girl was announced the name of the guardian dragon of the empire, the white and gold dragon Castellan, and in a solemn ceremony they would witness their marriage. The man congratulated my lady. Arabella brought her teacup to her mouth and whispered that this was all kind of crazy. She was still shaking a little. Betty whispered to the lady and asked her to be quiet. The girl smiled stupidly and thought it was all driving her crazy. The maid cheerfully announced that it was time for my lady to go back to her room and asked her to get up. Arabella decided that she couldn't stand it and wanted to run away. They went out into the corridor. The protagonist in her head to herself repeated the same thing, that she must escape. So when Betty turned away, Arabella took advantage of the situation and ran for the exit. The maid turned to call out to the Duchess, but only saw her running with her heels crinkling toward the door. Arabella thought it wasn't a marriage, but practically a kidnapping as she ran, Betty chasing after her. The girl yelled at her to stay away from her, Betty yelling back that the Duchess shouldn't run because it was bad for her heart. Arabella was indeed in pain, but at the turn the girl crashed into someone. The protagonist got a bump on her forehead. Betty screamed at the back of her throat. When the maid caught up with her, she put her arms around her neck and told her it was all her fault because she should always be by her side, never taking a step away, and promised that from now on she would never take her eyes off the Duchess. The man the girl had crashed into had been standing there watching them all this time, confused. Arabella was brought into the room and laid down. The man measured her pulse and asked what year it was. From behind, Betty beckoned to her that it was the 205th year of the Empire. When the girl did not answer, the doctor stepped back, and the maid began to whisper to the Duchess that it was the 2345th year of the continental calendar. The man stepped back to his suitcase and said the girl was fine except for a slight abrasion on her knee, promised that she would recover quickly if she drank and slept enough. Betty thanked the doctor. Arabella remained lying in bed. The maid came back to her disgruntled and began to reprimand her for not answering the doctor's question. And after all, she had told her everything yesterday. She had decided to tell the protagonist one last time, so she had to remember. When people said empire, they meant the Empire of Castellan. And when people said duchy, they meant the Duchy of Delure, where they were from. The duchy was part of the empire, but a century ago the emperor recognized Archduke Delure in battle and gave him the island. It was Delure that received the title of duke. In those days, the empire was in great poverty due to its territorial expansion. So, the Duchy of Delure renounced the empire and declared independence. The duchy soon became very prosperous due to maritime trade and various industries. The empire wanted the duke back. The Castellan Empire had managed to expand greatly during the reigns of the previous and current emperors, and after recovering from poverty, the empire was trying to bring the lands it had liberated back into its fold. The Duchy of Delure was no exception. It was obvious that the empire would want it back because the duchy had a well-developed economy. The empire tried to impose various restrictions on them, demanding them to merge with the empire. For example, the empire suddenly took away a trading partner who was on good terms with the duchy, or interfere with diplomatic relations with other kingdoms. And since the duchy depends on trade, This eventually made things difficult for them, and so the Empire offered to marry the girl to one of the princes. But Arabella indignantly began to say that she thought she was the Archduke's precious daughter. And besides, Arabella couldn't even speak yesterday and asked Betty how they could give her to the Empire. But the maid replied that they weren't really going to accept the marriage proposal, but were just trying to buy time until they could find another solution. The duchy sent a letter to the Empire explaining Arabella's situation and trying to come up with counter-proposals that the Empire could offer. The girl enthusiastically announced that the duchy had never thought that the Empire took political marriages so seriously. But what was surprising was that this was exactly what the Empire wanted. In fact, one of the imperial princes had volunteered to marry Arabella himself. The heroine interrupted her and decided to summarize. The girl began to say that the duchy tried to be smarter, but it was outsmarted. The position of the duchy Arabella was understandable, but the Empire behaved suspiciously, because why did the prince reveal a desire to marry the daughter of the Duke, who has mental abilities? Arabella angrily asked Betty who the prince even was. The maid began uncertainly that His Highness was the 8th prince of the Empire. The first wedding night came. Betty told Arabella that, first of all, the prince lived in a separate part of the castle. He has burns all over his body because in the palace where he lived with his mother, there was a fire, after which the noble wife died in the fire, and the 8th prince became a monster. A man came to the blonde girl's room, his face completely bandaged. The girl looked at him fearfully. She mentally asked herself to calm down and behave normally. She decided that she needed to find a solution to this situation, or rather, a way to escape. The girl trembled and thought that if she had been left at this estate to be sold as an object, she would really be doing Arabella a favor when she escaped from here. The man removed his hoodie and all the bandages from his body. The girl looked at him mesmerized. She had nothing against the 8th prince. Of course, he has a big scar and disability, but seeing his naked body, she was surprised at his trim body. She thought that perhaps the man had covered himself with magical cloths that were able to preserve such beauty, and his skin was not burned and everything was clean. Arabella could not see any burns. The 8th prince was a brown-eyed man with chocolate-colored hair. He called the girl's name, gently took her by the chin, and with the words, "My wife," pulled her to him. Arabella intercepted his hand. She was surprised that the guy didn't have burns and wasn't hunched over. The man shuddered and turned away from his wife. Dressing, he said his name in syllables. His name was Felice, and he had heard that the main character could only understand a few words given her intellectual abilities. Felice blushed a little and said that he hoped Arabella would someday learn to pronounce his name if he kept repeating it. The girl looked at him in surprise. The man sadly admitted that he was so shocked when he first heard what had happened to her that he couldn't even eat. But now, sitting down on her lap and taking her hand, he continued that he had brought her here as if nothing had happened. Kissing her hand, Felice said that even though it might seem like he wanted to take advantage of the girl, he didn't regret it. Arabella froze. The man leaned over to the girl and plopped her on the bed. Arabella's heart raced. She stared in surprise at Felice, who pinned her down and placed his hands on either side of the heroine. The young man said he realized he couldn't ask to be remembered and knew he was asking too much, but it was the only happy memory in his life, and suddenly confessed that Arabella had saved him. The protagonist, sweating with excitement, looked at him in surprise. She did not understand what he was talking about and assumed that the man had known Arabella before. Felice lay down next to the girl and, removing strands of hair from her face, called her his poor, innocent savior and said that if she didn't remember, then he would keep those memories for the two of them. The man swore to protect the girl from all this mess. Arabella was completely confused and didn't understand what kind of mess he was talking about and why there were so many problems in this world. Felice was scaring the girl. The man smiled and admitted that he had promised it to Archduke de Lure. Arabella began to blink often. She lay there without struggling so that Felice would not think she understood. His scent was so pleasant that she felt she was about to fall asleep. Arabella, before she completely closed her eyes and fell into sleep, heard the man promise her that he would protect her and her life, and he didn't care what happened to him. Little Arabella suggested that Felice should pretend to be sick. That is, act as if he were really sick. Then no one could bother him. For the girl said that her teacher did not force her to study when she acted like that, but then made her work twice as hard. Little Arabella, gesticulating vigorously, told her that even when her papa scolded the servants, he didn't get angry when they were sick. Instead, he got angry at the chamberlain who trained them. So she suggested that the boy pretend to be sick too, and handed him a small bouquet of clovers. He accepted it and hesitantly agreed. Arabella woke up abruptly. It was a dream. The girl was surprised that it was all a dream. Betty knocked on her door. When she came into her room, Arabella asked her where Felice was. The maid looked at her in surprise. The protagonist called her in impatience. Betty came to her senses and began to ask questions about whether she had met His Highness, what sort of man he was, whether his burns were really so terrible, and whether he was really a hunchback. She pelted the Duchess with questions, but her most interesting question was whether the first night had been awful or good. Arabella answered that it had been nothing. The maid was shocked, because at least something had to happen. The protagonist said that she had just fallen asleep and thought that he had quietly gone to sleep too. Betty, not believing, asked if she was telling the truth. The girl shouted that she was not making it up. The girl began vigorously shaking out the blanket, and at the same time saying that she was glad to see that Arabella could stand up for herself. The dust caused the girl to sneeze, and she irritably called out to Betty. Some sounds came from the corridor, and judging by these sounds, Arabella should go to breakfast, and the maid asked the Duchess to get ready. The protagonist arrived in the dining room, which was all overgrown in cobwebs, and the girl had a meager breakfast on her plate. Arabella touched the miserable-looking grapes with a trembling hand and asked Betty what was wrong with the food. The maid, sobbing, replied that they were broke. The protagonist exclaimed in shock how such a thing was possible. Felisa, the prince's manager, told Betty that that was all the food there was, 2 boiled potatoes and something else. Arabella, sighing, asked why that was so. The aide said that the imperial palace sends food supplies once a week, but they often don't send the requested items and only give spoiled food, and they were the only ones who were treated like this. Arabella was all cowardly. It was ridiculous. After all, Felice was an imperial prince, and they were in the middle part of the palace. She asked Betty how they could treat their own prince like that. The maid replied that His Highness had somehow received recognition from the king, and besides, his condition required daily medical examination. Charlotte, the emperor's consort, a woman with contemptuous green eyes and black hair tied up in a high style, took over the palace after the empress fell ill. And the problem was that she despised the 8th prince, and this lady was the second person in power to the emperor. Arabella was sick of it all. Betty excitedly explained that they had had provisions delivered yesterday, but that was all there was. She didn't know what to do. She was afraid they might starve to death right there in the imperial palace. Arabella asked Betty to calm down. She might have been sent here against her will, but she was the daughter of the Archduke, and asked her if she had anything of value. She asked her assistant to think carefully, because there must be something that would help them survive such treatment. Betty thought about it and remembered that the Duchess had a trust, a legal entity set up to manage the assets of a settler for the purpose of preserving them, multiplying them, and transferring them to an heir. Arabella exclaimed in surprise that she had not thought there would be something like this. Betty confessed that she had heard the girl's mother, her ladyship the Archduchess, leave a trust in Arabella's name when she was born. Betty suggested that it might be a large sum, so she should check her trust fund. They had to hurry. The protagonist was all brightened by this good news. Arabella asked that if there was a big sum there, how much could be there approximately. Betty wasn't sure how much was there. Then the girl asked what it would take to get the money. Betty excitedly told her that the Archduchess had passed, the Archduchess had left her wealth, but she was from the allied kingdoms of Couton in the south, and from the Duchy of Delure. The protagonist got quite close to her and asked her to cut to the chase, asking her if she had rights to him. Betty said she had heard that the Archduchess had placed funds exclusively in Arabella's name. Even the Archduke himself could make no claim, since he had originally planned to give it to his daughter after she reached adulthood. Arabella asked if the trust fund had become available when she was older. Betty replied that it had, since she had turned 20. But it turns out that the money must already be ready, because as the maid said, the girl was already 24 years old. Betty replied that they should be ready, but taking her hand, asked her to eat first, and confessed that in any case, in all the years she had served the Duchess, she had never seen anyone take Arabella's signature on a letter of authorization. The main character took a potato and started eating it, saying that if the trust fund existed, it would help them out of poverty and maybe even prepare them for the future. But the girl leaned tiredly on the table and began to say that the money was probably entrusted to the Delure Bank, and she would have to go outside the palace to get there. But unfortunately, she was a kind of hostage and a fool. And if she tried to demand the money a day after the marriage, they would definitely smell something wrong. All the while, Betty stared hungrily at the potatoes. Finally, Arabella noticed that something was wrong with her assistant. Betty apologized, saying she was trying to hold back, but she was interrupted by the Duchess, asking her if she had eaten today. Betty admitted that she hadn't eaten since yesterday, at which point the protagonist asked her to sit down. The maid apologized profusely and asked what the lady was not going to finish. Arabella replied that she was full, and rising, said she would go for a little walk, so as not to feel bloated. Betty asked where she would go. The girl replied that she needn't worry as she wouldn't be leaving the estate. And while she was still gone, she asked the maid if Arabella had been in the Castellan Empire when she was little. Betty was happily eating her potatoes and replied that she didn't know that. The blonde then asked, incomprehensibly, when Betty had started working for her family then. The maid, chewing vigorously, replied that she had been with her since she was 14. But Arabella told Betty that Felice had spoken as if he had known her in the past, which meant that they had probably met in the past before she was 10 years old. The maid replied that it had been around the same time that her condition had worsened, and she suggested that it was probably a coincidence. She had heard that Arabella was very smart until she was 10, but she had never been sick or had any accidents. It all happened suddenly. The protagonist asked in shock that this all happened when she was 10 years old. Betty answered affirmatively and asked why she was asking. Arabella shied away from answering and wished her assistant a pleasant appetite. The girl left the dining room and turned to her past self, thinking that only heaven had helped her get into the university, and it was true, for she had a hard case. When Seo-kyun was little, she went to a special school because she couldn't go to other schools. Her speech was slow. It took her a long time to react to anything, and she couldn't solve examples at all. However, for some inexplicable reason, her severe retardation suddenly disappeared when she turned 10. The girl immediately began to bring home single A's. In fact, the intelligence tests showed that her memory and comprehension were better than others. It was as if she had suddenly awakened her potential. The protagonist thought it was a miracle. Arabella was smart until she was 10 years old. And Seo-kyun had the opposite happened. She had low intelligence, but because of that she became dramatically smarter. It was very strange, and the girl thought it was more than just a coincidence. Arabella walked on the carpet and stopped to look at it, and then at the door she was standing in front of. She didn't realize where she had come to, because on the 4th floor, the girl had been thinking so much that she didn't remember how she had gotten here. But this part of the manor had different furniture. She reached for the doorknob, thinking it would probably be closed, but the door appeared to be open. Arabella apologized as she stepped inside and looked at the interior of the room in surprise. Inside it was clean and beautiful. You could see that the furniture was all new and expensive. The protagonist walked to the table with the words that it looked beautiful. It was even possible to have dinner parties here. Arabella decided to take a short break. She walked over to a painting that was bequeathed with a golden curtain. She opened it and saw a portrait of a strange girl. The heroine wondered who she was. Felice appeared from behind and called out to the girl. Arabella turned to him, frightened. The man said that he didn't want to scare her. In general, he came to find her. The girl shuddered and shook, mentally forcing herself to calm down and keep a calm face. Felice said happily that he wanted to tell Betty something about her, but he didn't think he would find her here. He came close to Arabella and, covering his eyes, said that he hoped she wouldn't mind. The girl got excited that he wanted to kiss her, but the man took the protagonist in his arms. He looked at her happily and said he knew it might be awkward, but asked her to bear with him for a while because he wanted to tell her about the estate at dinner. The girl blushed all over. Felice turned away and said it would be easier this way. In his mind, he apologized to the girl for not coming to see her lately. Arabella was reassured by the man saying that he was fine and knew that she would tell him not to retaliate, but he promised that he would make sure that Charlotte couldn't make it this time. It was time for dinner. There were all sorts of delicious things in front of the girls. They looked at everything in surprise and asked how this was possible. Betty said in shock that she had no idea they had such good ingredients. Felice asked that she must have been shocked now. The maid started playing the role as if the girl didn't understand anything and started explaining to her lady that it was food, so you could eat while you had it. The blonde pretended to be stupid and started repeating the word food. Felice noticed that the maid was not surprised by his appearance and told her that somehow the fact that he wasn't a man with burns didn't impress her as much as the fact that she could now feed her lady. He recognized that as an amazing devotion. Betty frightenedly replied that she was very surprised to see his face. Although the man could see that she was not surprised at all, he decided not to say anything. Instead, sipping his coffee, he apologized for the terrible breakfast. It was because the deliveries had been delayed, but now the pantry should be filled. Betty suddenly jumped up with joy and asked that they had gotten groceries after all, because Judy had told her that they were not getting any support or deliveries from the palace. Felice admitted that she was right. They really weren't getting any deliveries from the Imperial Palace, and he was sure that Judy hadn't told Betty anything about them at all. It was all because Judy was one of several maids who had worked on the estate since he was born and never says anything unless Felice tells her. The whole point was that they were getting supplies from out of here, and now they would be delivering what his wife, Arabella, and Betty might need. The young man said that if there was anything Arabella needed, Betty would just have to let Judy know, no matter how much it cost. And he also promised that he would start giving Betty a suitable salary. Felice wanted them to know that this estate was kept in such a state so as not to attract any attention, not because they were poor. The maid waved her hands fearfully and said that she shouldn't give out such information, because she was just a maid and not even from here. She insisted that she was a complete nobody, just a maid to serve the lady. The man smiled at her and told her that her rank was too high a position for such a statement. Betty shuddered. Felice called her by her full name. She was Bethany Phil D'Alia and was the daughter of Count D'Alia, and told the girl that if she thought he didn't know who she was sorely mistaken. The blonde stared at her perplexed, for she did not know that her maid was the Count's daughter. Betty wanted to ask how he knew, but Felice interrupted her and told her that the Archduke de Lure himself had told him about her identity. He also knew that she was an able attendant who was particularly attentive to manners and etiquette, and whose title was far above that required for such a position. Betty confessed that she had no idea that his lordship had told him about it. The man replied that she couldn't have known that, as their relationship with him was considered confidential. He was also told that the emperor had intervened to make sure that other maids and visitors from de Lure were not allowed here, and all of his wife's jewelry had been removed when she entered the palace. Felice had a guess as to who might have taken it, and gave the name of the girl, Letia. She was as greedy as her mother. The man said that they already had far more than they deserved in the palace, and wondered what more they wanted. Felice continued that for that reason, the Archduke had said that he had to be extremely careful about the people he kept around Arabella. Betty listened attentively to the prince. He continued that he had promised the Archduke that Arabella would be safe. Felice turned to the maid with an immodest request, to trust him, because he was not on the side of the empire, and to protect his wife was not only her duty. Arabella sat glumly in the tub. Betty stood nearby and wondered to the lady if the tub was warm enough. The girl said it was fine and called her Lady Betty. The protagonist was angry with her and angrily told the girl how she could hide such a thing from her. She had no idea that her maid was from a noble family. Betty began to tearfully apologize to the Duchess. She said thoughtfully that she should have told her everything, but she didn't want to introduce herself that way. Then the blonde asked why. The maid replied that she had chosen to serve her simply because of her kindness, for she had received many things after becoming a maid. The girl admitted that she'd never had to be rigid or suppress herself while she was around the Duchess, and liked the fact that she didn't have to fulfill the duties of a noblewoman. Betty cheerfully continued that Arabella had always tried to make sure she was comfortable around her, and even after the Duchess returned her speech, the heroine interrupted her. She called her over and held her hands, telling her that Betty was a good friend. Arabella didn't know what she was going through, but the girl promised that she would always listen to her, and the assistant could rely on her. Betty was already crying. The blonde slyly asked her why she was crying, but her friend said that it was just the bath foam in her eyes. Betty decided to ask the lady something. She was already staring at her questioningly. Her assistant remembered that the Duchess had said she had been alone with His Highness before dinner. She wondered what they had been doing together. Arabella started uncertainly and simply replied that it was beautiful. Felix brought the girl in his arms to a beautiful glade where incredible wildflowers grew. Ladybugs and other lovely insects flew everywhere. Betty, massaging the lady's head, clarified exactly what was lovely. Arabella replied that, listening to the stories on his hands, he told her that they deliberately furnished the estate with old furniture so as not to attract attention, and also told her about his youth. The maid squealed with delight, but Arabella admitted that it was rather hard. Pretending to be stupid was much harder than it might seem at first. Betty admitted that she was still jealous of her. The blonde, sitting in the tub all bubbly, said that when Felice had mentioned the name Letitia, he'd gotten angry. Betty admitted that she had noticed it. Arabella asked why she felt as if there must be something besides her attitude toward her. Could it be something else that made him angry? It looked as if there was a feud between them. Betty stood with the bucket and replied thoughtfully that she didn't know anything about it either. The blonde asked that maybe the assistant thought it had something to do with the vow he'd taken in the painting. From behind the girl, Betty doused with water and glumly told her to talk about pleasant topics while bathing, because all that negative talk was bad for her skin. The protagonist agreed. Then Betty asked excitedly if they could take a walk together in the garden or greenhouse. The blonde looked at her incomprehensibly and asked if they even had such a thing, and asked her to tell her more about the estate. The maid frowned that she thought the Duchess had not been there yet, and then told her that why don't she try to go out the back door on the first floor tomorrow. There she would find another door when she went outside, and finally when she went out through them she would see the very magical place. Arabella gazed admiringly. She saw a secluded spot in the garden, beautifully furnished, a marble bench with a stack of books on it, green and fresh everywhere, butterflies swirling in the air. The blonde enjoyed the sweet and delicate scent of the garden. She thought that Prince Felice's estate was a haunted house, but looking at the glassed-in greenhouse, she was absolutely delighted. They even had watermelons in the garden, and she wondered if that was what Felice meant by an independent source of provisions. Arabella looked around. It was incredibly beautiful here. The girl didn't even realize that there was a hidden garden. On the table she noticed a tea set. There was a 3-tiered fruit bowl, on which there were a lot of all sorts of different sweets, and there was a cake and other goodies. The whole table was full of sweets. The heroine touched the teapot. It was still warm. The girl wondered aloud how Felice knew she was here. Arabella, the more she got to know him, the kinder he seemed to her. The protagonist did not understand why he treated them so well, and why he was kind to the girl, who was just a silly fool. The girl was drawn out of her musings by Betty's cry. The maid was calling her at the top of her voice. Arabella turned fearfully toward her. The assistant, breathing heavily, apologized, but she had urgent news. The protagonist received an invitation. She was surprised by it and asked what the occasion was. Betty excitedly called out that Arabella should definitely attend the tea party at the Imperial Palace, because the man said it was sent by Her Highness the Empress. The maid was already picking out a dress for the Duchess. The main character stood looking at Betty in surprise, saying that the date seemed strange to her because the event was scheduled for today. The maid was angry and angrily replied that it was absolutely ridiculous, because how could you send an invitation on the last day, and it seemed obvious to her that they were just trying to tarnish her reputation. The blonde was getting angry too and asked if she might not go then, but Betty replied in a panic that she couldn't miss the scheduled tea parties. Arabella asked if it was that important. Betty, clutching her clothes menacingly, replied with anger and irritation that it was very important, because every girl who has established herself in the imperial palace will be there. In fact, every lady in a position above her will be there, inviting Arabella to come and greet them. And especially since they know about the girl's mental disability, she just has to be present, because otherwise they can accuse her of all sorts of ridiculous things. Arabella agreed, and asked then to go to the tea party, or else she would break her chaperone's heart if she didn't go there, and asked Betty to make sure Felice knew about it too. The girl sat down and suggested that she just tell Judy everything. Betty told her that His Highness had left the estate today because he had business to take care of. Arabella snickered and asked if that was true. Then the assistant asked what they would do. Betty reminded Arabella that they had taken all the jewelry and gifts. Here was her jewelry brought from the duchy. The protagonist, folding her arms across her chest, replied that meant she would just wear something else. Betty replied in a rage that everyone here was part of the imperial family, so they would all be dressed to the teeth. Then the blonde pointed her finger at the beautiful, bright, juicy yellow flowers and suggested they use them. The main palace, the Griffin Hall, all the important ladies were already sitting around the table and making small talk. One of them, covering herself with a fan, announced that Arabella had arrived. The girl was glowing and shining. Her hair was decorated with beautiful flowers. Betty said upset that it was a garden party. The invitation had said nothing about holding the event outdoors, but the blonde, passing a butterfly with her hand, cheerfully replied that who could care. The main thing was that the weather was fine. But the maid stood her ground and replied that the girl understood nothing, for finding the right shade was the key to an outdoor party. Arabella approached Betty and whispered who was sitting in the center. The girl also whispered that it was Her Majesty the Empress, and on the left sat and sipped tea, Her Highness Empress Consort Gila, and on the right her Empress Consort Charlotte. It was a lady with a black gargoyle on her head, and an evil face looked at the main character. Betty warned the girl that she needed to prepare for a hard day. Arabella asked why she was scaring her. Then, the maid asked if she could see two people sitting on the far right side of the table. They were Empress Consort Letitia and Princess Shara. Letitia was an exact replica of her mother. The maid asked the blonde if she could see their necklaces. Arabella innocently replied that yes, and they were beautiful, Betty explained to the girl, saying that they were her necklaces. Arabella flinched and looked in surprise at the two girls who were whispering to each other, glancing in her direction. A woman with a fan in her hands told the princess consort of the 8th prince that she was late. The blonde girl lowered her eyes guiltily, and Betty stood next to her. The girl had already prepared a speech, how she would apologize to the Imperial Highness. But then suddenly the maid fell at the feet of the women and said that it was all her fault. The plump woman who sat next to Imperial Highness suggested that perhaps Lady Charlotte had simply told her the wrong time. Charlotte asked Lady Gila indignantly that she was pointing out to her the flaw in the party she was throwing. Gila replied that that was exactly what she was doing. Then the black-haired lady abruptly put the teacup on the tea stand and loudly declared that she was going too far. After all, she had created the best conditions for the tea party. But of course, after Her Imperial Highness, the Empress herself had given her the right to receive guests, and calling Arabella a silly girl, asked her what she was picking on her for. The girl was already starting to get angry that she was being allowed to be called names so easily. Her Highness raised her hand in a sign to stop and replied that there was no need to blame her. After all, unkindness wouldn't make the right impression. It was just probably a misunderstanding, and asked her to show the protagonist her place. The maid thanked her. Arabella looked angrily at them. Letitia and Shara, squinting at the girl, giggled. The blonde was seated at a table with Letitia and Shara, right in the sun as she sat there, thinking she was going to burn. They just took it and sat her right in front of the sun. Such was their attitude towards the princess of the 8th prince. Suddenly a ray of sunlight flashed into Arabella's eyes. She exclaimed and covered herself with her hand. Opening one eye and looking at what made it happen, she noticed that Letitia, holding a turquoise necklace in her hands, was pointing it at the girl, laughing. There was a shimmer coming from the pendant into the eyes of the protagonist. Shara, a brunette with pearls all down the length of her hair, began to mock Arabella and asked Lady Letitia if she heard a scream. The black-haired girl put the pendant back, covering it with her hand and looking at the girl caustically. She replied that she heard it too and assumed it must have been a squirrel in the garden. The girls, looking mockingly at the blonde, continued to taunt. Letitia replied that a person didn't make that sound unless they were stupid. Arabella tried to calm down and not interfere. Shara, giggling, said that people used to say, the candidate for the throne would be a married prince. But now they would stop after the burned monster married a fool like the blonde. The girls were not embarrassed by the princess presence of the 8th prince. The brunette wondered who would be appointed as the next crown prince. Letitia replied that princes could only be married by order of His Imperial Majesty, but he hadn't been authorizing marriages lately. At another table where the noble ladies were sitting, Shara pointed to a woman with blonde hair strictly tied back in a bundle and with black eyes, said that she thought Lady Charlotte was behind the crown prince's death. Arabella casually demurred and asked how she would make that claim without any proof. She hadn't expected that of herself, and she glared at the worried girls. Letitia quickly told Shara that such things were not to be talked about here. The blonde quickly played dumb again and took the candy. The girls looked at her with relief. The brunette replied that there was nothing to worry about because she was stupid and didn't know what they were talking about. She covered her mouth with her hand and offered to look at her face. Shara didn't understand what Arabella had on her face because she looked pale, and the mess in her hair was embarrassing. The Empress rang the bell and announced that it was time to change the cups, so they would stretch their legs and take a walk in the garden. The brunette cheerfully suggested that they would feel better if they looked at the beautiful flowers. Letitia's response was a huge relief, for she didn't want to keep looking at Arabella's face. The girl herself remained seated and stared back at them with an angry look. Betty came up to the main character and said she needed to go for a walk too. The girl was angry, but agreed. In principle, she was not so bad at playing the role of a fool. No one tried to choose words in front of her. She learned that the crown prince had died, and no one knew who killed him. But the crown princess consort suspected Charlotte. After his demise, people started talking about the married prince will be a candidate for the next crown prince, because joyous celebrations like marriage would either be cancelled or postponed after the state funeral. That meant the state funeral was already over, and the crown prince had been murdered some time ago, Arabella thought. That he had died 1 or 2 years ago, but pondered whether Charlotte had really killed him. She came to the conclusion that there was something wrong here. Betty was walking beside her sad. The blonde noticed this and asked her in a whisper why she was looking at the floor and what was wrong. Betty replied that she was just upset. Arabella asked what she was upset about. Then the girl replied that the necklace worn by the princess of the 3rd prince, that is, Share, was a gift given to Arabella by his lordship the Archduke, as well as a wish for her recovery. And the diamond pendant worn by the 4th princess consort Letitia is a family heirloom given to her daughter by the Archduchess. And Betty had also heard that Lady Charlotte had classified her jewelry as a tribute to the Empire and given it to the imperial family. Arabella clenched her fists at this news. Betty understood that there was nothing they could do about their bullying, because that's the kind of people they were. But the fact that they were so obviously displaying the seized jewelry in front of their face to see the blonde's reaction was too upsetting for Betty. Everyone went back to the table. Letitia continued to scoff and point the pendant in the blonde's direction, saying she couldn't believe the girl had necklaces like that. Arabella flinched and frowned at her. Letitia kept saying right in front of Arabella that her husband was a monster hiding under his clothes, and she was a fool with nothing but her pretty face. Arabella shivered with anger and clenched her hands. The black-haired woman continued arrogantly, holding up her pendant that the duchy was very wealthy. But who cared if they had everything they wanted? And besides, she was sure the jewelry should go to more suitable owners. Arabella slammed her hand down on the table and got up from her chair. Betty jumped up to her, asking if everything was all right. The blonde turned to her and whispered for her to go to the carriage and tell the coachman that they were leaving soon. She had an idea, so the girl told the maid to stay away from here and ordered her to go now to the carriage. Letitia laughed at the way Betty addressed Arabella. The main character smiled. The girls stared at her incomprehensibly. Arabella, with the words, "Give her everything," grabbed the tablecloth and pulled. Everything that was on the table flew on the black-haired and brunette. The girl shouted angrily that it was all Arabella. All the candy and fruit ended up on the girls' dresses. Letitia angrily started yelling at the blonde, saying that she at least thought what she was doing. They were getting angry. Arabella reached out to her and said, "Give it to me." The girls didn't understand and yelled that how shameful is she not knowing her place. Letitia demanded that Arabella leave, but the blonde stood and smiled menacingly at them. The black-haired one asked why she was looking at them like that. She quickly walked towards them. The girls screamed. Charlotte turned at the sound and asked what all the commotion was about. She saw that Arabella was holding Letitia and Shara by the hair, the black-haired one demanding to let go. The brunette was subdued and couldn't say a word. The blonde held them tight and laughed. Charlotte jumped up and called to the guards in a panic to get her out of here. But the Empress raised her hand, stopping them, and said, covering herself with a fan, that it was better to wait until Arabella had calmed down before the guards intervened. The black-haired lady turned to her and scowled at her, telling her that while they were talking, her daughter and daughter-in-law were dying. But the Empress stood her ground, replying that broken dishes could cause additional risk. She was definitely mocking Charlotte and her lackeys. Arabella was having a good time at the same time, tugging at the girl's hair. Another girl with brown hair tied back nicely looked at her incomprehensibly. The girl sat in her room and said thoughtfully that it was over. Her maid didn't understand what she said and asked again. She began to ask excitedly that maybe she had done something wrong. The girl with the brown hair replied that she had done nothing wrong. Then the maid said that she had prepared a bath of saltless oil, thyme, and lemon in her room as she had ordered, and asked if anything else was needed. The girl replied that she wanted to be alone to reflect while she took a bath, so she asked her to tell everyone on the 3rd floor of the White Palace to leave. The maid left her chambers. Eta waited until the maid's footsteps were silent and took out a beautiful box from the dresser. She opened it, and a projection of Felis appeared there. He was in his usual appearance, bandages and hoodie, and asked the girl how the tea party was over. Eta answered him that he was asking the wrong question, for one should not ask how she was, but what she had done. The man then asked what she meant. The girl asked him to listen to her and started to tell him how Arabella grabbed and pulled Letitia and Shara's hair. It was a total mess. No one intervened until the fight was over. She didn't know why the Empress wouldn't let her intervene, but either way, his wife had a big smile on her face, and she assured him that he had no idea how intimidating she looked. Felice asked what happened to Arabella. Ada replied that the royal guard had taken her away. As the girl was led away under their arms, an excited Betty ran after them. Ada said that she had long pondered whether she should get involved, but remembered in time that the man had only asked her to watch her behavior. But Felice, he interrupted her by asking if she wasn't interested, and asked if his wife was in pain. The girl didn't bitch, and jumped up irritated, yelling that he was even listening to what she was telling him. After all, it wasn't Arabella who was pulling her hair, she was the one pulling everyone's. But the man replied that their hair jewelry could have hurt his wife's hand when she was pulling their strands. The girl was indignant but did not say anything. Felis was angry and asked where Arabella was now. Ada sank down. The man waited patiently for her. The girl, having made up her mind, answered that she was in the blue room in the Imperial Palace. In this very room where the protagonist was imprisoned, a pissed-off Betty stood and asked her what she was even thinking when she made such a scene. Because she's supposed to be slow, not crazy, just slow. Arabella lay on the bed and covered herself from her with a pillow. The maid continued in tears that she could only say 4 words, and was such a gentle soul. She recalled that the girl was just an angel when she smiled. She never pulled people's hair or laughed like a maniac. But the girl sat up on the bed and nonchalantly remembered that Betty had told her that she used to tear her hair and even cut it. The helper clutched her head with both hands in shock and shouted that she only did it with her own hair, not other people's. Arabella agreed and suggested they stop talking about hair, and asked to see the room they were in. It was all blue, and asked what kind of place it was. Betty sternly replied that it was a blue room. The protagonist, seeing with what face the girl answered her, could not contain herself and laughed. The maid asked why she was laughing since it was a very serious situation. The girl replied through laughter that the title sounded ridiculous, and they were even too lazy to come up with a normal title. Betty cut her mirth short and began to reprimand her for knowing what it meant to be locked up here, and began to tell her that a nobleman who had committed a crime was temporarily locked up in one of the blue, red, or green rooms. But it was the blue room that was for the most serious criminals. The protagonist looked at her in shock and began to get angry that they had put her among the most serious criminals because she had done nothing but pull out a couple of hairs. Could that be considered a serious crime? She asked Betty. The girl stood and angrily replied that the problem was that she had pulled the imperial princess and princess consort by the hair, and they had claimed to feel threatened for their lives. And now they were accusing Arabella of attempted murder altogether. Betty's whole body trembled, and in a panic she remembered and listed everyone who had been locked in the blue room, and for what exactly eventually most of the nobles who had been locked in the blue room died from the death penalty. Then Betty asked the princess if she realized what a serious situation she was in. The door to the cell opened, and a guard came in and asked if Her Highness was ready. The girl stared at him in fear, wondering who these people were. Suddenly Betty shouted from the side, saying that when her ladyship ordered her to go to the coachman and tell him the time of their departure, but she would not listen. Arabella stood there laughing at the situation. She didn't understand what was wrong with their legal system. At this time, the maid was confessing to her princess in a panic. She blamed it all on herself, saying she would never betray her. If she had known this was how it would happen, she would have obeyed. But the blonde wasn't listening to her. She just wondered if they were seriously going to execute her just because she was pulling someone's hair. Aita sat in her room and warned Felice that Arabella could indeed face the death penalty because she was accused of committing a crime. The reasons didn't matter. After all, she had harmed a member of the imperial family. What was worse was that Letitia and Shara had already stated that their lives were in danger, so releasing the blonde wasn't going to be easy anytime soon. The eighth prince asked what about the trial. Aita replied thoughtfully that she thought they would hold one. The laws of the empire required the entire imperial family to be present when sentencing other members of their family. The man replied that he knew. It was called a general court. The girl said that it was held under the supervision of the emperor, and the secret ballot was only held in the presence of the whole family, and the judge had the right to express his opinion, but had no right to vote. Felice said that the empress would be in charge at the trial when Arabella was tried, so she couldn't vote. Ada recalled that the Kazalan imperial family currently included 8 princes and 3 princesses, bringing the total to 11. The first princess had stopped living in the imperial palace after her marriage, but would likely arrive for the trial. Felice asked when the trial will be held. The girl replied that the first one, and if they can't get everyone together, the trial will take place after collecting letters of authorization from those who are absent. But Charlotte wants to take care of that as soon as possible. The man asked that she wanted it done as soon as possible. Ada said she did, and that was the most disturbing part, because no one knew what Charlotte was up to this time. The prince asked if she was going to kill Arabella. The girl replied that the blonde could easily get into trouble. Felice replied that it had to be stopped, so he was going to do whatever he could. Ada excitedly asked what he was talking about, what he was going to try to do, but the man had already passed out and wasn't answering her. Food was brought to Arabella's cell, Betty telling her lady that she needed to eat the food while they still had it, because who knew what could happen? Arabella lay on the bed with her arms spread out and said she couldn't eat because she felt her stomach was about to explode, because you could die from so much food. She couldn't eat anymore. The aide asked her not to joke about death because she couldn't imagine how scared she was when they came to see her because she thought they would hurt them. The people who Arabella thought had come to take her to the death penalty were only bringing her food. The blonde jumped up from the bed and yelled at Betty that she was so nervous about the death penalty that she had scared her that way. The maid apologized. The protagonist excitedly replied that it wasn't what she meant to say. It was just a joke. The girl saw that Betty was very upset and, feeling guilty, asked if her words had hurt her and asked her not to cry. Betty replied that she was not offended by her words, but thought it was wrong, and announced that she could not continue to dine with her and would eat at her own place from now on. The blonde looked at her in surprise and tears and asked her what, get this, she didn't feel comfortable around her. The aide hurried to reassure her milady and said that she loved being around her, but it was against the rules. Arabella exclaimed indignantly that she wasn't even used to this place. What other proper etiquette could there be? She didn't want to eat alone. Betty wanted to say something else, but the girl interrupted her and said they could talk about manners and etiquette later and asked, showing the spoon she was using, because Arabella had noticed Betty stirring all the food with this spoon before they started eating. The maid cheerfully told her that it was an artifact spoon that could tell if something had been poisoned. It was Arabella's spoon, and Betty had been using it since they were at his lordship's estate. The girl didn't even know they had something like this. The assistant replied that since she had finished eating, she would prepare her bath before it was too late. Betty went to the rope and pulled it, calling for the servants. A girl came in and asked if they had called her. The maid asked her to prepare the bath and said it would be lovely to add some saffron and rose oil and asked if she could ask her to put them in the bath. The maid replied that she could prepare everything. Betty turned to her milady and said that all of the bathroom supplies they had in the Delar were here, so they could use them. Arabella called her assistant thoughtful and thanked her. Betty warned the blonde that after her bath, she would need to return to the Red Palace, so she would have to sleep here alone. Arabella hesitated, but agreed. The maid took her hand and wished her never to give up or lose hope, and she promised that she would try to do her best. Arabella reassured her by saying that she had already done her best, but the girl replied that she didn't mean that. Then the blonde looked at her in surprise. Betty gently wrapped her arms around the lady's hands and clarified. What she wanted to say, she believed in the Archduchy, for they knew of her arrest there too. The maid was sure they were already aware of everything. She confidently reassured Arabella that they didn't need a report from a maid like her to figure things out, so she was sure the Archduke would do his best to contact them somehow. The blonde remained lying in bed and remembered Betty's words about being powerless and having nothing. But there was something she knew. Arabella wasn't alone. The protagonist could see that the maid was trying her best to keep her informed, but it wasn't enough because she was from Delure and they were in the Empire now, and that wasn't the information Arabella needed right now. The girl felt that she needed someone who would be on her side and who could give her such information. Someone who knew the Empire better than Arabella, and most importantly friendly towards her, and who would definitely not deceive her, and who could step forward and take her side. The girl jumped angrily from the bed and began to grumble that she remembered one such person, Felice, her husband. He had persuaded her with all his might that he would do and get her everything she needed. Arabella was covered head to toe in plaid and didn't see that she wasn't alone in the cell and kept nagging that he had promised her so much. But she was here now and he wasn't even showing. She started screaming in anger, resentment, and frustration that her husband had nothing and couldn't even protect her jewelry. And now he wasn't even trying to get her out of here. Arabella angrily tore at the plaid, wailing that he was very suspicious and wondering why he was even hiding such a beautiful body and face. And if it wasn't for his gorgeous looks, yes, not even looks, but if his voice wasn't so good, she would. But she couldn't finish as someone called out to her. The protagonist huffed and didn't dare turn at the voice. She was under the plaid, shivering with her whole body, asking why she could hear his voice here. Felice, in his cloak with a hood over his head, was amazed that his wife could speak. The man asked Arabella if what she had just said was true and real. The girl guiltily lowered her eyes and did not know what to answer him. The protagonist did not answer her husband's questions for a long time. He called her Arabella, humbled and covering her eyes, admitted that she had just spoken. She turned to him and, taking hold of his face, told him that she could actually speak. Arabella knew the shock Felice felt, because that was exactly how the girl felt when she realized how smooth his skin was. Arabella tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, she said. That she hoped it wouldn't take him long to recover from the shock. Because, the protagonist admitted, she had a lot of things she wanted to ask him. Morning came. Betty hurried down the hall to the blue room. The girl was lying on the bed under a plaid. The door opened abruptly, and a maid came screaming into the room, calling for the girl. Arabella jumped, startled at this awakening, and turned to Betty, looking at her perplexed. The girl screamed again right into my lady's ear. The protagonist was starting to get angry and asked what was wrong with her. Betty shouted in a panic that the girl needed to pack soon. Stammering, she told her that there was a messenger from the emperor waiting outside, as well as a messenger from the duchy, so Arabella should pack right now. The blonde was shocked at the news. Betty, distraught with worry and saying that since they were in a hurry, they would start with her hair first, hurriedly took a comb and began to pull my lady's hair painfully. Arabella began to scream that her hair was in pain. Betty excitedly noticed the mess on the girl's head and said she looked fine when she went to bed after her bath. She asked what had happened last night. Arabella remained silent. After a while, she replied that it was nothing much. She had been treated very well. Betty replied that she was pleased to hear that. The girl began to recall the events that had happened during the night. The husband asked the girl when it happened that she was able to speak. Arabella answered that when she was signing the marriage documents, then she suddenly came to her senses. She told me that realization had come back to her, but she didn't know anything. Not even that she'd lived a fool's life if Betty hadn't told her about it. In fact, she didn't remember her childhood either. Felice exhaled heavily. Arabella asked if he was okay. The man answered that he was fine, but he was a little ashamed. He told the girl that he knew it might sound like an excuse, but he knew they had the protagonist's jewelry, and realized that Charlotte had included it in the list of tributes to the empire on purpose. So he wanted an official letter from the emperor stating that there had been a mistake. But he never thought that Shara and Letitia would wear those necklaces to the party. Felice admitted that he hadn't expected her to go to the tea party at all. The girl replied that it was okay, because no one could have foreseen it. The girl woke up from her memories when she felt something prick her, and Betty was already apologizing to her. Arabella asked what it was. The maid admitted that it was a needle, and she was sorry. She was trying to fix the girl's skirt, but her hands were shaking with excitement. Arabella tried to calm the girl down, telling her to relax. After all, she wasn't the convict here. Betty, stammering, announced that everything was done and everything should be just fine and asked her to sit down. No sooner had the protagonist sat down than a messenger flew into the cell and said that it was a message from His Majesty the Emperor. The girl went back to her memories. Felice told her that the Emperor knew everything. Arabella exclaimed in surprise, asking what exactly he knew, the fact that he had no burns. The man began his tale. 9 years ago, Charlotte killed the Imperial Majesty Rosalina, his mother, and further killed the mothers of the 7th and 9th princes. So he went to the Emperor and made a deal with him and asked him for power. The protagonist remembered the name Charlotte and asked if this was the Lady Charlotte she met at the tea party today. Felice confirmed it and called her his mother's murderer. She was also the enemy of many other principals living in the imperial palace. She was the one who started everything he had ever done. The girl sat and listened to the message. The man read out to her that she had injured 2 members of the imperial family on the 7th of March, 250 of the imperial calendar. According to the wills of the victims and the traditions of the imperial family, the 8th princess consort would be sentenced for the crime of injuring a member of the imperial family. With each sentence, Arabella grew sadder and sadder. Betty, standing behind her co-lady, stammered and asked how it was that her duchess had been condemned. She did not believe it. The man continued. Arabella looked at him with hope in her eyes. However, first, the proposal to keep the accused for attempted murder locked up would be rescinded in accordance with the royal physician's report that the extent of the harm was not threatening to his health. So Arabella Bliss Ayu Delure is released from custody and will be allowed to await trial in her municipality of residence. The girl was all brightened up. She smiled and thought that she knew it would be like this.